Hello! Welcome to a new video on this channel. So, what do I want to do in this video? What do I want to show you? Very simple. We're going to see how we can use NotebookLM to create a complete course syllabus, including theory, practical exercises, labs, exams, and so on. The video is designed so that we can follow this process with any topic we want to learn. Obviously, as you know, my courses and videos are geared towards the technological world, and the example I'm going to give you is specifically about Docker. It's therefore a technology-related topic, but in this tutorial we'll go step by step, and you can apply it to any educational field, that is, not only to technological topics, but to any kind of subject, okay? As I mentioned, what we're going to do is study Docker from scratch to advanced, and we're also going to create elements such as videos, presentations, exams, questions, practical exercises, labs, and so on, okay? We're going to go through a step-by-step process so you can see how we can put together a complete course. It goes without saying that these kinds of tools are very helpful in preparing this type of training, but they shouldn't be your only source, since you'll usually need other types of data or other sources to really get to know the product. And above all, let's not forget that practice is the best way to learn. But really, I think that tools like NotebookLM, which have just appeared, will allow you, among other things, to delve deeper and be more independent when training yourself, both personally and professionally. Okay, let's start with the practical part, which is what you're interested in, so you can see how you can prepare a complete training course with a tool like this.
The first thing to do, once I've accessed NotebookLM, is to create a new notebook. I'm going to select this option to create a new notebook. For now, I don't want to upload any sources, because first I want to tell you a few things. I'm going to click on the X to close the window. The first thing we need to know is what sources I can upload to properly prepare for this course. I could search the web for things related to Docker, such as documentation or tutorials, and I'll probably find plenty. But remember that a product like NotebookLM is designed for you to upload more or less specific documentation, that is, to narrow down the data context you want to work with, so that it helps you better grasp the concepts you want to learn. Although I'm going to show you a simplified process for uploading documentation, this method is more than enough to get started. However, I recommend that in your real projects, you always select the documents and websites that add the most value to your research. For example, since I want to learn Docker, I have two resources prepared here. On one hand, I have the Docker Docs source, which is the Docker documentation, and on the other hand, I have the Podman documentation, which is an alternative to the current Docker that is being used on most Linux systems. In the case of Podman, you can download the PDF in the bottom right corner at the time of recording this video. If I select this option, I can see the link to the PDF. My intention is for you to try uploading a URL or web address and then uploading a PDF file. Therefore, download the PDF so you can use it later. The first step is to give the notebook a name, something like Docker Course, to clearly indicate its function. So, what's the next step? I need to add the source where the Docker documentation is located. Therefore, I select the option Add Sources, and all I have to do is enter the URL of that documentation. I already have it prepared, and I just need to paste that URL. And there we have our first document to work with in this notebook. In fact, notice that the short description tells us that this documentation is a comprehensive resource for developers, etc. Now I'm going to add another source, but in this case a PDF document, which is the one we downloaded earlier. I just have to select the option Upload Document, and it adds it to the list of sources with the corresponding name. Therefore, I now have two pieces of content to work with. Note that in this case, NotebookLM might take a little longer to analyze the document because it's reading a relatively long text. Remember that you can search the web, even doing deep research, which in this case I don't think is relevant to what we're looking at, okay? Once we have the documentation uploaded and ready to work with, we make sure we have all the sources, in this case just 2, prepared to begin. So what's the first thing we should do? Obviously, we need to create an index, some kind of syllabus that will help us with the course, and for that, who do I have? Well, NotebookLM. I've prepared a prompt for you, which you can find in the resources for this video. In the video description, I've included a link where you can download the guide in both Spanish and English, so you can decide which language you want to use to prepare for the exam or do your practice exercises. Therefore, I'm going to paste the prompt I've prepared, which is quite simple, okay? As always, you can go further and extend it, adding whatever you want. In this case, I'm telling it that I want to act as a DevOps engineer when implementing this course. I want you to generate a detailed index from beginner to professional based exclusively on the sources I've uploaded, which are the Docker and Podman documentation. This way, I can easily learn from scratch to very advanced concepts, because ultimately, the idea behind this video is that you can even prepare for the Docker certification exam. Here, I'm telling you to create an index where the course should be divided into logical modules. Each module should have a learning objective, the key points to understand in this chapter, and a lab section with suggested exercises. I'm telling you to not use any external resources and to rely solely on the documentation we have here. In fact, since I'm working with NotebookLM, that's how it works. That is, as of today, when I'm making this video in January 2026, NotebookLM isn't going to search the internet for anything. In fact, I can't tell it in the chat that it also searches for information online. If I want it to search for something online, I have to add it as a source. The chat won't let me do it. Then I ask it to please format the output in Markdown so it's easier to read. Then I click the Run button. Depending a bit on the documentation we have, its size, the number of sources, etc., it might take a little more or less time. Remember that this is an example that you can apply to any type of course or any type of learning. I'm going to pause the video while the process finishes. As you can see, it's finished now. If I scroll down here, I can see that it says it has created a course index from beginner to professional based exclusively on the data sources I have on the left. Here, as you can see, it tells me the module title, the learning objective, the key points we should study in this chapter, and some lab exercises or examples I can use or do. Of course, we can expand on this chapter by chapter. We'll see that now, as it's another step we'll take. If I scroll down, we see that it has specifically listed N modules. Once I have it, obviously what I don't want is to lose the index I've been working with. If I continue the conversation, the index will keep moving up. So, what can I do? I'm going to tell it to save it as a note. I'm going to click here on this button, and on the left, it will generate a note that will allow me, let's make this a little bigger, to save the information it's giving me so I can use it later. Once I've created the note, I go into it and change the title. I'll call it something like Docker Index or whatever name you prefer. To save it in a safer place, I can select this option and tell it to upload it to Docs, okay, to Google Docs. So now, once I have it, it uploads to Google Docs, and I have my course outline saved in my Google Drive so I don't lose it. In fact, I would advise you to do this for all the products we create, saving them in your Google Drive so you don't lose them. Well, in any case, as I mentioned, this is the next step we've taken. I now have my course index ready. Okay, so what's next? We're going to ask NotebookLM to generate the course requirements. Although we could have included them in the course index, I preferred to put them separately for clarity. I'm going to put something like this in the prompt. Hey, tell me what prerequisites I need to take the course, both in terms of knowledge and software or hardware. If I click Run, it should generate a document telling me what I need,
what software I need, what type of machine, Windows or Linux, the physical resources, etc. Then, if everything is correct, and according to the sources we have here, it will generate the necessary requirements to take the course. It basically tells me that I don't need any prior knowledge, that I must be able to access the command line, what type of server or PC I need, depending on whether I'm using Windows or Linux, hardware resources, etc. As I said, I'm not going to dwell too much on the answers, as I'm not interested in them right now. I just want to be clear about what I'm doing. I would, of course, recommend that you save the requirements as a note, as we did before. Once created, we go inside, change the title to Prerequisites, or whatever you deem appropriate, and of course, as we did before, export it to Google Docs so we have it available for later. Okay, so I now have my syllabus ready, and therefore I also have the course prerequisites prepared. Up to now, we haven't used any of these tools in the right-hand panel, but it would be a good idea to start using them, right? So let's suppose that what I want is a Docker command guide, so I can have them handy and use them whenever I need. For this task, I can use the data table. Note, if you don't have a paid version of Gemini, some of the resources in the right panel might not appear. Google typically includes some components in the paid versions first and then adds them to the free version over time. Within the data table, I can click on the pencil icon and specify what I want. In other words, I can customize the request I make to NotebookLM. I have a prompt prepared where I tell it to create a table with the basic Docker and Podman commands, their functionality, options, and the possible differences between the two tools. Remember that the prompts and all the steps I take are available in the guide I've included in the video description. If I run it, NotebookLM will generate a data table, which I can then use if I have any questions about a command. I can look it up in the table and say, look, the command to create a container is done this way. Well, once I've finished, if I open it, you'll see that it has indeed created a table with all the Docker and Podman commands. In this case, they're practically the same, but I've included it as an example to show you the possibilities. In this case, I can export it to Google Sheets, so my table is saved in my Google Drive with all the commands and options. As I said, this is just an example that you can then customize to your liking. Remember that here, within the table options, if you select the options, I can also export it, in this case to Google Sheets. As you can see, we already have 3 main sections prepared. What have we done so far? We've uploaded the documentation, created the course index, asked for the requirements, and also requested a Docker command table. Now, what's next? Basically, I need to develop the chapters you suggested within the course index. So, what are we going to do? It's very simple. We'll select the index we created here, then go to the 3 dots and add it to the data sources on the left. We'll select the Convert to Source option, and that way we'll add it to the left panel. Therefore, NotebookLM will take it into account for the questions I'll ask in the chat. I won't have to ask you to find the index we discussed anymore, since I already have the index, the syllabus for my Docker course, included in the Sources block, so NotebookLM will be able to use it without any problems. Okay, assuming we want to go into more detail within each chapter, I've prepared a prompt to tell it to use all the available resources to generate detailed information for, say, Chapter 1. This prompt is very simple. Remember, you can find it in the video resources in the description section. Here, I'm telling it that I want to learn the content of Chapter 1. I'm asking it to act as a teacher based on the sources I've uploaded to NotebookLM and generate a structured lesson according to the following points. I'm asking it to teach me the fundamental theory and key concepts, trying to define the most important concepts within this chapter. I'm asking it to use commands and practical examples if the course or syllabus is technology-related, so I can better understand the theoretical content.
Then I can also ask it to specify which part of the documentation I have on the left or which part of the data sources contains the information it's generating.
Finally, we can add something else, such as creating a short exercise, asking me a question, or providing a scenario for me to practice or work through an example. In a later step, we'll ask it to generate more comprehensive exercises. I'm also telling it not to invent anything. If it can't find something, it should tell me directly that the sources don't contain that information. Anyway, since we're using NotebookLM, I'll reiterate, it won't search outside of it because it doesn't have that capability. Therefore, it will stick to our defined boundaries, to the context, to the content I've uploaded to the data sources on the left. I also tell him to use a professional tone, and at the end, to generate the information in Markdown format, so I can extract it more clearly, for example, to import it into Google Docs. Once the prompt is finished, I run it, and as always, he starts thinking. Well, as you can see, he's finished. He tells me he's done a study of what we need based on the data sources I've compiled. As I mentioned, I'm not going to look at the content because I might find it better or worse, but since it's an example of what you can do with NotebookLM, there's no point in looking at it. In fact, we could refine the prompt, for example, to explain more clearly what a container is or what OCI is. From here, I can start asking him about the generated content. You can even go to Gemini, ChatGPT, or any other tool to expand your knowledge. Then, as we've done throughout this video, I would save it as a note to keep the result. I click the button to generate the note, open it, and change the title to, for example, Chapter 1 of my course, so I can save it, and then, as always, upload it to Google Docs to have it ready to use later. In fact, another thing I could have asked in the prompt is whether I'm a beginner or if I already have some knowledge of Docker and therefore might benefit from more detailed information. That would make the content vary in difficulty. As I mentioned, this is a video that aims to give you a basic overview, and then you can refine it to suit your needs. Okay, so what's the next step? Well, we could create elements from the right panel, which allow us to delve deeper into the course content and will greatly help us understand the concepts. For example, we can create a presentation. To customize it to our liking, instead of directly selecting the option, I can select this pencil icon here. Once inside, I'll tell it to do something very specific. As you can see, in this case, it asks if I want to generate a detailed presentation or a business-type presentation. I can also select the language in which I want to generate the presentation. Then I indicate whether I want it to be long or the default length. It depends on what we want.
I'm going to add a simple prompt here where I want it to generate a presentation for the content of Chapter 1. Of course, you can modify this prompt to include more information with more or less detail. Okay, since I already have the chapter content prepared, let's generate the presentation. I'm going to click Generate and wait for the process to finish to see what it's done. As you can see here, it's finished. If I open it to see what it's done, you'll see that it includes an introduction to Podman and containerization. The great thing about this tool is that if I don't like what it's generated, I can delete the presentation and modify the prompt to suit my needs. As I said, I'm not going to go into detail about what he's telling me. I assume he's read the documentation and is explaining the concepts I asked him about related to Docker and Podman, etc. What could we do now that we've done the presentation? Well, basically, we could do the same for audio or video. In other words, we could tell him in this option that I'm going to create an audio recording, actually a podcast, that will allow me to learn everything in Chapter 1. This first option, for example, has two people talking about the content in a very fluid and engaging way. This could be very useful for me to see what Podman and Docker offer and for them to explain what I need to know. In this other option, you can generate a critical audio track, or this other one for a debate, etc. The same applies to video, where you can use these styles to tell it what you want to generate.
In the case of video, you can use this option, called Custom for personalization, and tell it to describe how you want it and what you want it to generate. In this case, continuing with the example we did for the presentation or the audio, we can add a prompt here. For example, I want it to tell me what's in Chapter 1. So I'm going to add the prompt here, which I've made very easy, very simple, but as I said, you can make it more complex. And as for the visual style, in this case, I'm going to tell you to make it technological so we can clearly identify or see in detail the technical concepts we're studying. This will change the icon types and the way the video is visually represented. Remember, if instead of Docker we're studying, say, Roman history or ancient American history, then obviously the style should be different. But anyway, I'm going to click Generate here and wait for it to finish. Therefore, I'm going to pause the video while it finishes. Once it's finished, if I run it, you'll see that it's a video very much focused on what was covered in Chapter 1. The idea now would be to watch it and see its content, but you'll realize that it's a video, in this case quite technical, as I've indicated, and also, if you notice, the icons and visual style it uses are basically technological in nature. The best thing to do is run it and see a short example of how it works. Then I indicate whether I want it to be long or the default length. It depends on what we want.
Welcome. In this explainer, we're going to get our hands. It's a perfect place to start. It's super tiny, but it packs a ton of. This slide clears up a really important idea. The uploads the image from your computer to that public library. When you see a message like this, it's portable and flexible. So, let's do a quick.
Well, I think this is enough for you to see that it's a video with technical aspects, both spoken and visual. Of course, you can download it here to take with you and study it at your leisure at work. So, we've seen how, working with this environment, we can have, on one hand, a presentation, on the other hand, audio, and on the other hand, video, as if I had a private tutor explaining the course I want to learn in different ways. Okay? Now, let's take another step in this training and specify the exercises I want for each lab for each chapter. The first thing I can do is send a prompt indicating that I want some guided exercises, some guided labs. In this case, I've created a very simple one, which is this. As always, you have it in the guide I've prepared in the video description. I'm going to paste it in the chat. Create some practice exercises based on Chapter 1 that will help me better understand the theoretical content. I'm going to click Generate, and as always, NotebookLM will do its research and try to generate a specific exercise. Of course, I could have asked it to make 2 or even 3. The thing is, you don't really have limits, so to speak. Even if you ask it to make 1 here, in 2 minutes you can say, "Look, I'm not quite clear on this. Make me another exercise." As you can see, it's already finished. I have Exercise 1, the theoretical part, the assignment you have to do, another exercise, etc. In this case, it gave me 3 exercises. As I said, you can refine this and even ask it to make more practical examples, less practical ones, with more commands, with fewer commands, etc. As always, I would advise you to save it as a note. Open the note and rename it, for example, Chapter 1 Exercises. Once you have it, save it in your Google Docs to keep the index, content, theory, etc. Everything NotebookLM has generated. In fact, even though you can't do it directly with the video, for example, since it doesn't have a Save To button, you can download it and then save it separately. But on a practical level, in addition to being able to tell it to generate specific things, we also have some very interesting components here, such as flashcards and quizzes. To work with them, as always, if you select them directly, the problem is that it will create general flashcards or quizzes from all the data sources, which isn't what we're looking for. We should select the pen here, tell it how many cards we want, few or standard,
the level of difficulty, higher or lower, and most importantly, for our case, for the course I am taking, fill in the prompt indicating that I want them to be from Chapter 1.
In my case, therefore, I'm going to paste it here. I tell it to use Chapter 1 to generate the component. I click Run, and if everything is correct, it will do it. This is usually quite fast, and basically what it will generate, as you know, are a kind of cards that ask me questions. I have to guess the answer, and above all, the most interesting thing is that I can ask for explanations. But anyway, let's let it finish. Okay, you can see that it's finished. If I run it, I can see that it asks me what the definition of Podman is. Each card below has the answer. I can click that option to see the answer, and as you can see, it tells me that it's an open source environment, etc. I can see different cards. You can see that I have 60. Remember that I can add more or less. The most interesting part is here, in this option, where I can ask it to explain the answer. If I select it, it will show me the information regarding the answer on this card. So as you can see, it's quite interactive. I can learn as I go through the 60 cards. I can see exactly what each answer and question is based on, and therefore learn much faster. And remember that once you've finished, you can still go into the chat and ask for more information on a specific topic. I'm going to close this component. The same thing happens with the quizzes. That is, if I select the pencil icon, I can customize the answer. I'm going to tell it more or less the same thing. I'm indicating that I want to use the content of Chapter 1 to create the quiz. I'm going to click Generate, and as always, I'm going to pause briefly until it finishes. Okay, you can see it's finished. If I select it, it's similar to the flashcards. It has 10 questions, and as you can see, it's a multiple choice question. I should indicate which one is correct. I also have a hint here, which is a clue that helps me know or determine the answer. If I click Next, I move on to the next question, and so on. So I can learn a lot here when working with these kinds of environments, because I not only have the theoretical part, but also the practical part, with an exam or set of questions, just like I would in front of a regular teacher. That's what quizzes and flashcards are for. Remember that you can always do certain things with the 3 dots depending on the product. Each one has different possibilities. Remember that tools like NotebookLM also connect with Gemini to integrate notebooks and ask broader questions than I can ask here, since in that case it connects to the internet to search for answers. Okay, let's wrap up this video, which, as you can see, has gotten a bit long with the final part. Let's suppose I want to get certified in Docker. I've already studied all the chapters, learned everything I need to know, studied a lot of theory, and completed a ton of practice exercises, quizzes, exams, and so on. Now I want to get certified, and for that, I'd like NotebookLM to prepare some quizzes and even some real-world exercises based on the certification. What would I have to do? Well, I probably don't have anything here in the source code, or I don't have enough information to get certified. So what am I going to do? I'm going to add that information as a source. I have a Docker certification example prepared here from Mirantis, which is currently the owner of Docker, so to speak. And here, as you can see, is the Docker Certification Study Guide. So I can download it as a PDF, which is what I did, and I'm going to add it to my notebook sources so it can prepare a set of practice exercises based on the Docker certification. I'm going to come back here, tell it I want to add sources, and upload that PDF of the certification guide. As you can see, I've already uploaded it. It's here. It's called the Docker Study Guide. And basically, it will allow me to add different materials and data to my information sources so that NotebookLM can extract or create exam questions based on the certification guide plus the additional documentation it already has. I'll wait for it to finish before continuing. Well, as you can see, it's finished. If I go inside, I can see that it's the document that discusses the Docker certification. I'm going to go back because ultimately the most important thing in this case is that you upload any documentation you need here. And to finish this video, I'm going to tell it in the prompt that I want it to create a set of questions and answers to prepare me for the certification exam. I'm telling it to try to make them as similar as possible to the actual exam questions and to use the same format as the certification exam. Remember, because I'm being repetitive, all these questions are in the guide I've prepared within the video. You click Run, and if everything is correct, it will start reading the sources and generating the corresponding questions. As you can see, in my case, it has already finished. It generates everything necessary, including the question types, the answers, etc. It has tried to read all the information in the study guide and is suggesting a practice exam here, so I can test it. Remember, I can repeat this process as many times as necessary to prepare another set of questions. As always, I recommend saving this as a note, upload it to Google Docs, and then have everything better organized. Of course, we could explore many more things and create more examples, like the one I mentioned about going to Gemini and using the notebook to learn more. But I think this is enough to show you the power of this tool for preparing any kind of learning experience. For example, I used Docker, but maybe you want to learn gardening, cooking, or building wooden cabinets. In any case, by providing the necessary information and setting up the steps I want to take, the result is incredibly efficient and functional for these kinds of things. Okay? Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video on the channel.